Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. On the back of one fiasco after another in the Middle East, the U.S. says now it is willing to engage Iran. After decades of prosecuting a covert and proxy war against Iran, can Washington change its behavior? Many in Washington have dismissed Obama's olive branch out of hand. Many in Iran are just as mistrustful. Is this quest for peace a fool's errand? To CrossTalk Olive Branches, I'm joined by Mehdi Halaji in Washington. He's a senior fellow at the Washington Institute. Also in Washington, we have Michael Hughes. He is a freelance journalist and foreign policy analyst. And in Tehran, we cross to Fouad Izzadi. He's a political science professor at the University of Tehran. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Fouad, let's go to you first in Tehran. Do you believe a word that Barack Obama has to say, given the last 30 years of bad relations between the two countries? And I'm talking about covert, overt operations up to this day.
Well, you know, the last 30 years cannot be blamed on Obama. I think he's responsible for his own presidency. And he has been relatively a better president when it comes to Iran when you compare him to others. We have had occasions where the US Congress wanted to pass a new sanction against Iran, and he has opposed those type of sanctions. And in his speech at the UN, I think he had a couple of good points. That was the first time we have heard that from a US president. For example, he talked about President Rouhani having a mandate from the Iranian people, basically recognizing that there is a vibrant democracy in Iran, and that a president is elected by the majority, and then he has a mandate from the majority.
Fouad, if I could just jump in right here, but don't you think Mr. Obama is very much alone in Washington? Because the Congress is not going to go along with him. I mean, he has a long, long way to go, and we'll talk about forces in Tehran. But, I mean, that's what I'm getting at. Obama's words are just words because the political establishment isn't with him, at least at this point. Go ahead.
You know, we could recognize three different groups in Washington when President Rouhani visited New York last week. One group basically read the talking points from Tel Aviv, repeated what Netanyahu said about the trip. A second group sees Rouhani as an opportunity to get things from Iran that they couldn't get from Ahmadinejad, the previous president. And then a third group is actually a group that has recognized that Iran has the right to enrich uranium inside the country, and they want to reset Iran, US policy toward Iran. The only problem we have is that the third group, the good guys relatively, are the minority, and the first and second group are the majority within the US foreign policy establishment. And that's the problem that we have. And I think what Dr. Rouhani needs to do is actually work harder to make the third group the majority by policies that he sets, things that he says. As I said, Obama was saying good things, some good things in his speech
all right.
at the UN.
Okay, the leaders are saying good things. Mehdi, if I go to you in Washington, okay, where do we go from here? Some pleasantries have been exchanged, but that's not policy.
That's true. When they meet in Geneva and talk about the concrete steps both parties should take to build confidence and also describe the negotiation successful or a failure, we would see which one is more serious, which one is more determined to compromise. We haven't started that process yet. So it's too early to talk about the seriousness of President Obama or the seriousness of President Rouhani. I think up to now, they just exchanged nice words and they made lots of public relations stuff, but we have to see when it comes to the action, which one is really able to deliver its promises.
Okay, Michael, I'll go to you. Who's blowing the most smoke here so far?
Well, I think we need to keep in mind that Obama rallied the entire world to implement the strictest sanctions on Iran in history, in world history.
Yep.
And number two is he's got pressure from Congress on both sides of the aisle. They want, to pressure Iran, and there was a deal that Russia was involved with. There was an Iranian swap deal not too long ago that, because of Congress and the State Department, that window was missed. So we got to think of those two things. Those are both in, the Iranian conscience through this whole thing. So, forgive them for having doubt. And then again, it goes both ways. So the Iranian leader reached out to the American people through an op-ed. And Obama responded in kind, and then there was kind of the awkwardness when they didn't meet and shake hands and have the photo opportunity. But I always say Obama doesn't have to get reelected, and the Iranian leader does. So come on, give me a break. If the shoe was on the other, foot, Obama would be reluctant probably to do a photo op while he was running against Romney. So that's where we're at. It's tough. It's going to be tough for both sides. There's decades of mistrust there, but I'm hopeful. I think it's better to reach out and it's better to negotiate than not to.
Yeah, but don't you? Let me go back to Fawad
and
Saran. I mean, it's better to talk when you can make a deal. Okay. Can both sides make a deal? Because we know the problems that Obama has, and with AIPAC, and we have the Israeli lobby and Congress. They're already saying they're very skeptical, extremely skeptical, and that they even have more sanctions to pass. But the State Department's asking, just wait a little bit longer. Let them talk a little bit first. I mean, I'm very pessimistic here. After 30 years, it's hard to break habits. Let's go to Tehran.
Yes, on Iranian side, I think the government is very much ready for some sort of rapprochement. We had Iran's leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, making a speech a week before Rouhani's trip and talking about flexibility and being able to reach a compromise. The problem, as you said, is actually the Israeli lobby in Washington that does not want to see a reset of U.S. policy toward Iran, and they're quite powerful. Whenever we have sanction bills in the U.S. Congress, they generally get passed in Senate 100-0 or 99-1, and to change that vote to where new sanctions bills are not passed, it's going to be quite difficult. I think you're right.
Okay, Mehdi, if I go back to you in Washington, so what's different this time? The only difference is that there's a new president in Tehran? Is that the only difference? Because if it's about the nuclear program, the two countries had very bad relations for 30 years, way before that nuclear issue was on the table. Go ahead.
Exactly. Let me tell you something before answering this question. Some people exaggerate about the power of Israeli lobby in Washington, and I think Israeli lobby would be flattered by these exaggerations, and they don't have any problem with it. But it's misleading for analyzing the situation. The problem with Iran, with Islamic Republic, and with its nuclear programs is not only an Israeli problem. It did not start yesterday. Iranians blame United States for its role in 1953 coup against Prime Minister Mossadegh, and Americans blame Iran for seizing its embassy in Tehran in 1979. The hostility between two governments is deep-rooted, and it goes beyond Israel. Of course, Israel cannot accept nuclear Iran, but we shouldn't forget that the extent to which Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Persian Gulf countries are worried about Iran's ambitions is not less than Israel. Many Arab countries in the region believe that Israel is a strong country and it's a U.S. ally, and Iran would not harm Israel if it gets nuclear capability. But nuclear capability of Iran would change the power equation that would give lots of room of influence for Iran over Arab countries, especially small countries like Qatar, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and so on. So the nuclear program is not an Israeli problem.
Well, I'm sorry, but I mean, Mr. Netanyahu had control of the American airwaves for almost 3 or 4 days after his speech. So I think, you know, it is a pretty big red line for the Israelis there. Michael, if I can go to you, really what it's all been about. No, let me go to Michael here. Let me go to Michael here.
Say that it's not.
Well, it is important, but it's a bigger picture, and I want to ask the bigger picture from Michael here. And it's always been about regime change. And the nuclear program has been one element to get there.
Yeah, and it is regime change. And after Iraq, the reality is Obama or the next president, are they really going to strike Iran? I mean, all the experts say it's even CIA, they say it's the most ridiculous concept in the world. It's not going to stop the program. It'll be destructive. It'll unleash chaos in the whole region. But you have this, small subset in the U.S., even a minority of Jews that even are. It's a minority of the Jewish community here and the Israeli community here that wants to strike, that wants regime change. Which, based on recent history, I think that's crazy. And the question is, are the Iranian leaders going to how long are they going to let their people starve? And is the U.S. ever going to strike? And, I mean, if you had a bunch of foreign policy experts in the room, I think they would say, at some point, Iran is probably going to get a nuclear weapon. And, deterrence may be the question. It's like, how are we really going to stop them at the end of the day? And it's up to the Iranians. How long do they want to suffer? The Iranian leaders, are they willing to compromise? Do we really need another country with nuclear weapons? Because it will start a nuclear weapons race. The Saudis aren't going to sit around and say, okay, let's
All right, gentlemen,
Iran
let me jump in here
weapon.
on a very important point. Let me jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on U.S.-Iranian relations. Stay with our team. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing relations between Tehran and Washington. Fouad, I'd like to go back to you in Tehran first. It seems to me, I'm looking at the bigger picture of 30 years here, and the one theme is that it seems evident from the American side and from Western capitals is that Tehran simply has to surrender everything, and then we can have a deal. That's what it sounds like in the essence.
And I wanted to say something about the nuclear issue, and a statement that President Obama read at the UN had this sentence that Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapons program. And that's a contradiction. There's a contradiction between what he said and what James Clapper said a few months earlier. Yeah. James Clapper, as you know, is the Director of National Intelligence. He is the leader of all U.S. intelligence communities. And he had a testimony at the U.S. Senate on March 13, 2013. And in that testimony, he talks about Iran's nuclear program. And then he says that we do not know. This is a quote. We do not know that Iranian leaders have decided to have a nuclear weapons program, which means that not only Iranians don't have a bomb right now, not only they don't have a program to make a bomb, they have not even decided to have a program to make a bomb. And you put that statement, James Clapper's statement, next to Obama's statement, and you see that Obama is going too far. We don't have a bomb, we don't have a nuclear program, and talking about Iran's pursuit of nuclear program is repeating what Netanyahu says, which goes back to the point that Israelis have a lot of influence in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Another thing that Obama said in his speech was, he said that we are not after regime change. But the only problem with that statement is that the U.S. government, since 2006, has been spending about $100 million every year on what they call democracy promotion in Iran. And this is just the State Department funding and open source funding. We don't know what CIA is doing, how much they are spending. So we have all these contradictions, and I think, Peter, you're right that you have to be a little bit worried that on one hand, they are accusing Iran of things that it's not doing. They're spending money on changing its government. And on the other hand, they are saying that we want to improve relations. You have to worry about that.
Nadia, if I go to you in Washington, I mean, if we can look at the surrounding area, we have Iraq. It didn't have weapons of mass destruction. It was invaded and essentially destroyed. Libya gave up its weapons of mass destruction. It was invaded. It was essentially destroyed. We'll see what's going to happen in Syria. I mean, people in the region have to be looking around and say, is there a learning curve here? Because disarm, make friends, and then, you know what? Regime change. I mean, I'm not being an advocate for Tehran, but I mean, recent history kind of gives you a clue of what the Americans actually think.
Look, there are two things that I have to raise here. One is that there might be some a difference of opinions in Washington or in other European capitals about whether Iranian regime is trying to weaponize its nuclear program or not anytime soon. But there is no doubt, or there is little doubt about Iran's objectives. Nuclear program is a tool, is not an objective. The objective is to have supremacy in the region, is to threaten the interest of United States. Not only United States and West have waged a cold and covert war against Iran. Iran, in the last 30 years, has killed Americans in Lebanon, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere, and threatened U.S. interests everywhere in the world. So you cannot just put the blame on the United States.
Okay,
Iran is
Mehdi, but do you think that really Iran is a direct threat to the United States of America? Do you think that's true?
I think a weaponized nuclear program is a direct threat to the security and safety of the region.
Well, and there's no evidence of that yet. And there's no evidence of that yet. Would you agree or disagree with that? There's no evidence of that.
No. Look, we have to. No, the world international community is trying to stop Iran from reaching that point.
Okay.
If Iran had a nuclear capability, we couldn't talk about the deterrence. We had to talk about containment.
Okay, let's talk about deterrence. Let me talk about deterrence. Michael, let me go to you. Let's talk about deterrence.
Look, Iran has hidden its nuclear activities.
Well, we don't know that. The IAEA says different things. Let me go to Michael. Let me go to Michael in Washington. Fair time, everyone. Michael, let's say Iran gets one nuclear weapon. Okay? And it declares it to the world. I wouldn't be surprised if it was obliterated 15 minutes later. Is that a deterrent? Actually, it makes Iran more of a target, doesn't it? More than it is.
Right. I would say people will be reluctant to attack a nuclear, even if it's one or two. People are going to be. I would think they'd be reluctant to go after anyone. Who knows? In my opinion, who knows what could happen? But I mean, how many nukes did Mao have? That guy was insane. He said he wouldn't care to wipe half the world away. And I mean, frankly, some Russian rulers, I mean, they had access to a lot of nukes, but deterrence seemed to work for both sides. The U.S. has a lot of nukes, so.
It's a good point.
Think most people want Iran to get a nuclear weapon, but if that happens, I think we have to rely on deterrence. At that point, it might be too late to invade.
Okay, Fouad, let me go to you in Tehran. I mean, there was a very good historical comment made here: Communist China. Okay, and if I can remember correctly, know my history, is that the United States and the Soviet Union had arms agreements and didn't destroy each other. China understood the game of deterrence as well. I mean, what makes Iran so much different for the Western world and certain lobbies that you mentioned at the beginning of the program? Why would Iran be seen to be different? It's out of self-defense.
Right. Based on what we hear in Tehran, Iranian government has decided not to weaponize its nuclear program because of the reason you mentioned. Iran becomes a target of more sanctions, more difficulties. And United States has, I don't know, 7,000 nuclear warheads. Iran, even if makes one nuclear bomb, is not going to be able to compete with the United States in that area. So they are not going that route. I would encourage your viewers to go back to a debate, vice presidential debate between Joe Biden and Paul Ryan in 2012 election. And in that debate, Paul Ryan was basically talking the same way that Mahdi Khaliji is talking, repeating Israeli talking points with regard to Iran's nuclear program, and accusing the Obama administration of not sanctioning Iran more and not doing more. And what Joe Biden said in response to Paul Ryan was quite interesting. He used this word malarkey, which I didn't know what it meant. And I went and looked up the dictionary. And malarkey means just useless talk.
It means more than that, but okay.
Just talking about, so we have to be careful when you accuse a country of having a nuclear weapons program, and then you sanction its people inhumanly. You know, we have a lot of difficulties. Medicine is short in Tehran. People are suffering from these sanctions based on malarkey, basically. And you have to be careful not to accuse a country of things that it's not doing. Biden was talking about the fact that Iran doesn't have the enriched uranium that is needed, enriched uranium that's needed to make a nuclear weapon. Biden was, in response to Paul Ryan, Biden was saying that Iran doesn't have a weapon. It may have enriched uranium 5%, 20%, but doesn't have a weapon, and other things. So we have to be a little bit careful when we repeat Israeli talking points.
Okay. Mehdi, if I go back to you in Washington, I always try to be an optimist because I'm for peace. What should one thing Washington could do, one thing Tehran could do to get this whole thing started, if it's going to go anywhere at all? One on each side, please.
The level of mistrust Mr. Obama had about Iran's nuclear program was not less than any other president in the past. And what Fuad says is not reconcilable with Obama's policy since he came to office. He has managed to create an international consensus over sanctions which were unprecedented in recent years.
Michael, if I could go to you, as I just asked earlier, what's one thing Washington can do and one thing Tehran can do to get some kind of negotiation starting, if it's going to happen at all?
Oh, I think each side can, just show a reasonable step forward, whether it's the U.S. fully engaged in Iran, visiting, making a visible sign of trying to negotiate, and maybe Iran just making sure that their intentions are peaceful, letting an inspector in, or each taking one step that way towards a possible long-term goal.
Okay, Fuad, if I go, you could finish up with you in Tehran here. Maybe just end some of those senseless sanctions. That would be a good step.
Yes, and I think the Iranian administration, President Rouhani, needs to work on U.S. Congress as well. Just talking to people at the State Department is not going to be enough. We need to have a campaign of really letting the American people also know what is real Iran and what Iran is doing, and sort of working against the propaganda that's coming from Israel.
Okay, on that point, gentlemen, we've run out of time. Thank you very much. Many thanks to my guests today in Washington and in Tehran, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love you.